Okay, let's truly unpack this. There are very few questions, really, that have haunted or fascinated humanity more profoundly than this one. What happens when we die? It's a mystery, isn't it? Right at the core of our existence, something we've wrestled with, feared, dreamed about for, well, forever.
Yeah. Well,
And among all the ways we've tried to answer it, the idea of rebirth, reincarnation, it really stands out. It's ancient, it's persistent.
And it feels intuitive to many people, even though it challenges our standard Western view of life.
Exactly. It's got this pull.
Absolutely. And it's not just a simple belief in some kind of, vague afterlife. The concept of rebirth, especially as it's laid out in the sources you brought for this deep dive, it's about a fundamental, continuous journey of being.
A journey. Okay.
Yeah. It suggests that a non-physical essence, call it a soul, spirit, or maybe just a stream of consciousness that kind of depends on the tradition, doesn't just poof, vanish when the body dies.
Right.
Instead, it continues on, starting a new lifespan in a different physical form. It tackles our deepest anxieties and hopes about mortality head on.
It really does. It speaks directly to that human search for meaning, doesn't it? For understanding if there's a bigger picture, a purpose beyond just this one shot. And what's so fascinating, and it's clear right from the start in these materials you've gathered, is that while we might immediately think Eastern spirituality,
which is fair, it's central there.
It's not historically limited to just that part of the world. This idea pops up in really diverse ancient cultures. You mentioned the Greek pre-Socratics thinking about souls moving between bodies.
Right, transmigration of souls. And even Celtic Druids had similar beliefs.
So it suggests maybe it fulfills some really deep psychological or existential need across different cultures, different times.
I think that's a key insight. It provides a framework, for grappling with things that seem unfair.
Yeah.
Why do some people seem born into immense suffering while others have it easy, seemingly undeservedly?
Yeah, the problem of suffering.
Rebirth offers a sense that maybe life isn't just random chaos, that there might be an underlying order, a reason. And crucially, many traditions say it offers a path toward eventual liberation from suffering itself. It gives meaning to what could otherwise feel like a pretty bleak or unjust existence. It's a way to think about cosmic justice, maybe, or at least a process.
And like you said, it's absolutely foundational. It's central to those major Eastern traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. See that so clearly in your sources.
Definitely.
And weaving through all of them, kind of providing the engine, the logic that connects one life to the next, is this really powerful, complex idea of karma.
Yes, karma. The word itself, it's Sanskrit, means action or deed. Simple enough, right?
Sounds simple.
But in this context, it's way more than just action. It's treated as a metaphysical principle of causality. The core idea is that every action you take, every single thought you think, every intention you hold, it all generates consequences.
Yeah.
But these aren't necessarily like immediate rewards or punishments. Think of them more as energetic ripples, or maybe informational imprints.
Imprints. Interesting.
Yeah, that ripple outwards and across time. They influence not just what's happening to you right now, but they profoundly shape the conditions, the experiences of your future lives.
Ah, okay. So it's less like some cosmic judge handing out sentences.
Right. Not really that.
And more like an inherent universal law. Like cause and effect, but playing out over lifetimes. Almost like physics, but metaphysical physics.
That's a good way to put it, exactly.
Yeah.
It's seen as a fundamental principle woven into reality itself. And it sets up this profound moral and ethical framework for the whole cycle of existence. Your current life, your personality, your talents, your challenges, from this perspective, they are, at least in part, the result of actions and intentions from past lives.
Wow.
And just as importantly, your actions and intentions right now are actively creating the future, not just tomorrow, but potentially many lifetimes down the road.
That's a lot of responsibility.
It is. And this whole continuous process, this perpetual wandering through birth, life, death, and then rebirth again, that's what these traditions call samsara.
Samsara.
Yeah. And the engine driving that cycle, keeping it going, is the continuity of consciousness, which carries these karmic imprints forward.
Okay, that sets the stage really well. We have this ancient idea, popping up across cultures, deeply tied to karma as this universal law driving the cycle of samsara. Now let's dive into those foundational texts you included. How do these specific Eastern traditions articulate this journey? Because they aren't all the same, are they?
Not at all. The scriptures from India, things like the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the core teachings behind Buddhism and Jainism, they offer remarkably detailed and philosophically rich maps of this territory. They don't just say rebirth happens. They give these intricate frameworks for understanding the nature of whatever it is that's reborn, the forces that keep it going, and crucially, the ultimate goal, how to get off the wheel, how to transcend the cycle altogether.
Right. And Hinduism, drawing from texts like the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita you mentioned, seems to start with a really powerful vision centered on an immortal soul.
It does. The absolute core tenet in Hindu thought, as you see in these sources, is the concept of the Atman. This is the immortal, eternal soul, the true self.
Atman.
And this Atman is fundamentally distinct from all the temporary stuff, the physical body, the mind, the ego, all the things that change and eventually pass away.
So the real you isn't the body or thoughts.
Exactly. It's this eternal Atman that goes through samsara, that cycle of birth, death, rebirth. And what drives it and shapes its journey is karma. The Atman keeps going through this cycle until it achieves moksha.
Moksha, liberation.
Liberation, release, freedom from the cycle, and the quality of your actions, your karma, in each life. It profoundly influences what kind of birth you'll have next, what your destiny within that cycle will look like. So accumulating positive karma, usually through living virtuously, doing spiritual practices, is seen as making progress on that very long journey towards moksha.
The Bhagavad Gita uses that really vivid image to explain the soul moving between bodies. The one about changing clothes. I found that really striking in your notes.
Oh, it's classic for a reason.
Yeah.
It's Krishna explaining to Arjuna, the warrior, who's freaking out about having to fight his relatives.
Right.
Krishna tells him, basically, don't grieve over the death of the body, because the true self, the Atman, is eternal. And the line is something like, as a man casting off worn-out garments takes other new ones, so the embodied soul, casting off worn-out bodies, enters into others that are new.
Wow. Simple but profound.
It really is. It's saying the soul itself doesn't die or get destroyed. It's just a natural transition, like taking off old clothes that are worn out and putting on fresh ones. It emphasizes the soul's enduring nature, completely independent of whatever temporary body it's wearing.
And the Gita also brings in another concept that seems really key for understanding how patterns carry over, not just identity, the idea of samskaras. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yes, samskaras. This is subtle, but super important for understanding the continuity between lives. They're described as subtle impressions, or latent tendencies, maybe psychological imprints.
Like grooves.
Exactly like grooves. Left on the soul or the consciousness, streamed by every thought, every intention, every action you've ever performed across many, many lives. Think of them as deeply embedded patterns in the subconscious, almost like a kind of spiritual DNA or karmic residue.
Okay.
And these samskaras, they form a sort of subconscious blueprint. They influence your innate character, your natural talents, your irrational fears, your predispositions towards certain things, even the kinds of circumstances you tend to find yourself in this current life.
So that's the direct link. It's not just abstract karma floating around. The samskaras are the mechanism actually carrying the effects forward within the person.
Precisely. They act as a form of subconscious inheritance that goes deeper than just genetics or your upbringing. They help explain, from this perspective, why you might have an inexplicable phobia of water, or a natural gift for music you never formally learned, or why you keep repeating certain relationship patterns. The idea is past actions leave these energetic imprints, the samskaras.
Okay.
And these imprints then influence your thoughts, your desires, your actions now, which in turn create new karma and new samskaras, keeping the whole cycle turning.
And the Gita makes that interesting point, too, that even though the soul carries these samskaras, our conscious mind, our everyday awareness in a human body, usually forgets the details of past lives.
Right. Krishna says that directly to Arjuna.
Yeah.
Something like, both you and I have passed through many births. I remember them all, but you do not. It highlights this difference between the eternal consciousness Krishna represents the divine, which remembers everything, and our ordinary conditioned human consciousness, which is veiled. The memory is usually hidden. It implies that while the essence of the experience and its karmic imprint, the samskara, are carried forward,
right,
the explicit biographical memory, like I was Cleopatra's cat, that's usually inaccessible to our normal waking mind.
right.
Which sets the stage for why remembering past lives, when it does seem to happen, is considered unusual or requires special insight.
Moving to the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, another key text you flagged, it uses even more evocative, almost poetic language for that moment of transition, right?
At death. It really does. It paints this very poignant picture of the soul leaving the body. One analogy compares the dying person separating from their physical form and senses, even as a mango or a fig or a banyan fruit separates itself from its stalk.
Ripe and ready to fall.
Exactly. It suggests a natural readiness, a detachment. And then the soul hastens to its new abode, like someone getting ready for a trip and there assumes another newer body. It implies purpose, movement towards the next destination.
And there's that image of the leech, too, which is even more direct about the continuity, isn't it?
It is. The Upanishad says the self is like a leech. A leech, when it reaches the end of a blade of grass, takes hold of another blade and draws itself to it.
Ah, okay.
It's a great analogy for emphasizing that continuous, natural movement. It's not like leaping into an abyss between lives. It's a seamless flow. The soul secures its connection to the next life before fully letting go of the last one. It ensures consciousness keeps going without interruption.
So what does this Upanishad say keeps the whole cycle, keeps samsara running? What binds us to it?
Primarily, it points to desire kama and ignorance of vidya. Our attachments, our cravings for worldly experiences, possessions, status. Also, our identification with a temporary body and mind. And underpinning it all is this fundamental lack of understanding of our true nature, ignorance of the Atman.
Right. That's what creates the karma that keeps us tethered to the cycle. Liberation, or moksha, from this viewpoint, happens when those desires are finally stilled and the true self, the Atman, is realized. Not just intellectually, but experienced as being one with the ultimate reality, Brahman.
That quote you highlighted really nails it.
Yeah.
But he in whom desire is stilled suffers no rebirth. Realizing Brahman, he becomes Brahman. That sounds like a total transformation.
It is. It describes not just escaping from something suffering, the cycle, but profoundly merging into something, realizing your essential oneness with the absolute. It means you transcend the whole illusion of being this separate, limited, wanting individual stuck in karma and suffering.
Okay.
And you recognize your true nature as actually that unbounded eternal consciousness, Brahman itself. It's the ultimate fix for both desire and ignorance.
Okay, so Hinduism gives us this picture. Eternal Atman, driven by karma, carried in samskaras, cycling through samsara, aiming for moksha, which is realizing oneness with Brahman. Now let's shift to Buddhism. It also talks about rebirth. Punarbhava, you called it?
Yes, Punarbhava. But as you noted, there's a huge philosophical difference there, centered on this idea of anatta, no soul. How does that work?
Yeah, this is a really crucial distinction and probably one of the hardest things for people used to the idea of a soul to grasp. Buddhism, unlike Hinduism and Jainism, teaches anatta, which translates as no self or no permanent soul.
No self.
Now, this doesn't mean nothing gets reborn. It means there isn't an unchanging eternal entity, like the Atman or the Jain Jiva, that hops from one body to the next. Instead, Buddhism talks about a causal continuum. Think of it like a stream of consciousness or energy carrying karmic imprints that flows from one life to the next.
Okay, a stream. So if there's no self in that permanent sense, what exactly is it that gets reborn? What keeps the stream flowing without a soul?
That's where the causal continuum, powered by karma, comes in. It's not a who that's reborn, but more of a what a complex, ever-changing bundle of conditions, phenomena, mental states, karmic tendencies. The classic analogy they use is lighting one candle from the flame of another candle that's about to go out. The flame on the new candle isn't the identical flame from the first one, right? The wax is different, the wick is different, but it's causally connected. It's a continuation of the same energy, the same process. The quality of the new flame, the nature of the next life, is determined by what fueled the previous flame, the karma of the past life. But there's no unchanging flame soul that jumped across. It's a process, not a thing.
That analogy helps. So the Jataka tales, those stories of the Buddha's past lives, they're illustrating the continuity of the process then, not a soul's biography.
Exactly. The Buddha, after enlightenment, supposedly remembered countless past lives, and these are recounted in the Jataka tales. They aren't presented as the story of one unchanging soul evolving. They're seen as illustrations of that long, difficult process of karmic development. How positive qualities like compassion and wisdom are built up, and negative tendencies overcome over countless lifetimes. It shows the journey of that consciousness stream towards eventual Buddhahood.
And the ultimate goal in Buddhism, Nirvana, that's also different from the Hindu idea of merging with Brahman.
It is. The goal is Nirvana. This isn't about realizing oneness with a universal soul. It's about the complete cessation, the extinguishing of suffering, desire, and ignorance. These are seen as the root causes of karma and the whole rebirth cycle.
Extinguishing, like blowing out the flame.
Kind of, yeah. Nirvana is liberation achieved by rooting out and eliminating the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. These are the fundamental drives that create bad karma and keep us trapped. The Noble Eightfold Path, right view, right intention, right speech, and so on, provides the practical roadmap, the ethical and meditative training to achieve this cessation, which ultimately means ending the cycle of Punarbhava.
Okay. You're bringing in Jainism, another really ancient tradition from India. Your notes say it does have an eternal soul, the Jiva, similar to the Atman.
Yes, the Jiva.
But it has a very different idea about how karma works, something about particles.
Yeah, this is really unique to Jainism. They do believe in an eternal individual soul, the Jiva. And like the Atman, it's considered inherently pure, omniscient, and blissful in its natural state. But here's the twist. Jainism views karma not just as abstract consequences, but as actual, subtle karmic particles.
Like physical matter, tiny bits of stuff.
Almost. Like incredibly fine matter that is literally attracted to the soul and adheres to it based on your thoughts, your words, and your actions.
Yeah.
Especially actions involving violence or strong passions.
Wow, that makes karma sound very tangible, sticky.
It does. And this accumulation of karmic matter is seen as literally weighing the Jiva down. It obscures its natural light, its inherent knowledge and bliss, and keeps it from realizing its true potential. This is what they call karmic bondage. It's what ties the soul to the cycle of samsara.
So the goal is to scrub the soul clean.
Pretty much. The ultimate aim in Jainism is moksha, also called Kevala Jnana, which means absolute knowledge. Liberation is achieved not by merging into anything, but by rigorously purifying the individual soul, shedding all the accumulated karmic particles until the jiva can shine forth in its original, pristine, unburdened state.
And the path to get there involves some pretty strict practices, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. It's a path that requires intense ethical discipline and often quite demanding ascetic practices. The whole point is to stop the inflow of new karmic particles and actively burn off the old ones that are stuck to the soul.
How do they do that?
It's guided by the three jewels: right faith, having the correct understanding, right knowledge, and right conduct, living ethically. And the absolute cornerstone of right conduct is ahimsa, nonviolence. This is taken to an extreme in Jainism, extending care and avoidance of harm to absolutely all living beings, even microscopic ones. Once the soul manages to free itself completely from all karmic matter,
Then what?
it ascends. It floats up to Siddhashila, which is described as the realm of liberated souls at the very top of the universe. There it exists forever in a state of pure consciousness, infinite knowledge, and perfect bliss, completely free from karma and the cycle of rebirth.
When you lay them out side by side like that, like in that table you provided, the differences on the core question of what is the self are really striking.
It really throws that fundamental philosophical tension into sharp relief, doesn't it? Is identity carried by an eternal, unchanging thing like the Hindu Atman or the Jain Jiva that gets covered in stuff? Or is it more like a dynamic, constantly changing stream of consciousness, as in the Buddhist idea of Anatta?
Yeah.
And this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate. It profoundly shapes how each tradition understands what actually transmigrates, what needs to be liberated, and what liberation actually looks like in the end. Is it merging? Is it purification? Is it dissolving the very idea of a fixed self? They offer distinct, incredibly complex maps for navigating the same fundamental human intuition about continuity beyond death.
Beyond the scriptures themselves, some traditions talk about actually experiencing these deeper realities directly, right?
Yeah.
Including past lives. through things like yoga.
Yes, absolutely. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which are kind of the foundational text for classical yoga philosophy, go beyond just describing the concepts. They actually talk about the experience of recalling past lives as a potential result, a possible side effect, you could say, of very advanced spiritual discipline.
Effect. Or a power.
It's listed as a siddhi, which means a spiritual power or accomplishment. This suggests it's not just random or hypothetical, it's something potentially attainable through specific yogic techniques. It's seen as a sign of progress on the path.
And the technique mentioned is samyama, right? What exactly is that?
Right, samyama. It's basically the combined, intensified practice of the final three limbs of Patanjali's eightfold path: concentration, dharana, meditation, dhyana, and complete absorption, samadhi, all focused intently on a single object or concept. And Sutra 2.18, which you noted from the sources, specifically says that by performing samyama on the latent impressions, the samskaras we talked about earlier.
The samskaras again.
Yes. By focusing intense meditative awareness on those deep-seated patterns, a yogi can gain knowledge of their past lives. The implication is that these memories, or at least the energetic traces of past experiences, aren't lost. They're stored somewhere deep within consciousness.
Like a hidden hard drive.
Kind of. And through this highly refined, laser-focused awareness cultivated by samyama, one can potentially access that hard drive directly. It presents past life recall not just as belief, but as a potential spiritual capacity, achievable through dedicated practice. These deep layers hold the record, you might say.
Paramahansa Yogananda, the yogi who brought Kriya Yoga to the West, he talked a lot about this from his own claimed experiences, didn't he?
He did. Yogananda often spoke not just from interpreting scriptures, but from what he presented as his own direct, true knowledge and experience. He taught that many highly advanced yogis consciously maintain their self-awareness right through the process of death and rebirth.
Wow.
And he himself recounted quite vivid recollections of past lives. He mentioned being a yogi in the Himalayas in a previous incarnation, and even suggested, quite remarkably, that he might have been Arjuna in a past life, receiving the teachings of the Gita directly from his guru, Mahavatar Babaji, whom he saw as an embodiment of Krishna.
That's quite a claim.
It is. But his point in sharing these was often to emphasize that understanding karma and reincarnation, especially through direct insight like this, brings tremendous clarity. It gives confidence, inspiration, reveals life's deeper purpose, and shows the continuity beyond just one lifetime.
It's fascinating how this yogic perspective offers a kind of metaphysical explanation for how these memories might even exist. That developing heightened spiritual awareness allows you to directly perceive these karmic traces stored in the, subtle body, causal body.
Exactly. It frames the ability to remember past lives not as some random psychic fluke, but as a natural, although very advanced, result of transcending ordinary states of consciousness through disciplined inner work. It suggests a potential mechanism for accessing these deep memories that's distinct from, say, spontaneous recall in children or modern therapy methods. It links intense spiritual practice with the possibility of remembering across lifetimes.
Okay, so we've journeyed through these incredibly deep ancient frameworks, the philosophies of soul, karma, liberation across these traditions, plus the idea of direct yogic perception. Now let's make a shift. We move into the modern era, where researchers have actually tried to go beyond scriptures and spiritual claims to systematically investigate alleged cases of past life memory, looking for, empirical data.
Right. It's a big shift. It's one thing to read about rebirth in ancient texts or hear stories passed down. It's quite another to try and apply something resembling scientific method to real-world cases, especially cases involving very young children who claim to remember a previous life. And your sources highlight some key figures who really dedicated their careers to this incredibly complex and, frankly, controversial area of research. People like Dr. Ian Stevenson, his successor Dr. Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, and Dr. Brian Weiss, the psychiatrist focused on regression therapy.
And that work on spontaneous childhood recollections, really pioneered by Dr. Ian Stevenson, it sounds groundbreaking just in terms of its scale and the meticulousness of the approach.
Stevenson's work was truly pioneering. He was a psychiatrist, initially quite skeptical, who began his systematic research into these spontaneous cases back in the early 1960s. And his goal was really unprecedented at the time, to bring empirical rigor to a phenomenon that had mostly been the stuff of folklore or religious belief.
How did he even go about it?
His methodology was incredibly painstaking, especially for that era. He would gather extremely detailed statements from young children, usually between about 2 and 4 years old, who had just started talking spontaneously about memories they said were from a previous life. He focused on cases where the child gave lots of specific, unusual details.
Okay.
Then he'd launch these extensive investigations, sometimes lasting years. He'd often travel huge distances, across continents even, working with interpreters, trying to track down the family of the specific deceased person the child claimed to have been.
Wow.
And then the really hard part. He'd meticulously cross-reference every detail the child stated, with documented facts about the deceased person's life and death. He'd interview multiple independent witnesses connected to the deceased person, trying to verify details the child couldn't possibly have learned through normal means in their current life.
And ruling out normal explanations must have been crucial, absolutely central to his method. He spent a lot of effort trying to exhaust all the conventional possibilities first. Could the child have overheard adults talking? Was there some unknown family connection? Could they have seen something on TV or read something? Was there any chance of deliberate fraud by the families?
Right.
Now, critics definitely argue he couldn't always rule these out completely, which is a fair point in such complex situations. But Stevenson's process involved incredibly detailed documentation and investigation, specifically aimed at eliminating normal information transfer as much as possible before he'd even consider a case as potentially suggestive of past life memory. And the sheer volume of cases he studied, he documented over 3,000 and published hundreds in meticulous detail in his books. That sheer volume presented a major challenge to easy, conventional explanations, especially because of the striking consistency and specificity of the details reported across cases.
And maybe the most compelling and honestly kind of startling part of his research for a lot of people is the physical stuff, the birthmarks and birth defects. Yes. This is probably the single most difficult aspect of Stevenson's findings for skeptics to just wave away. He documented numerous cases where children were born with birthmarks or sometimes quite significant congenital physical defects that precisely matched in location and appearance fatal wounds or other distinctive marks on the body of the deceased person the child remembered being.
Like, how specifically?
For instance, a child remembering being shot might have 2 birthmarks, one small and round, one larger and irregular, in locations corresponding to entry and exit wounds. Or a child remembering death by stabbing might have linear birthmarks matching the knife wounds. These weren't just vague spots. In many cases, Stevenson managed to obtain autopsy reports or medical records for the deceased person, which confirmed the details of the wounds. And the birthmarks on the child lined up remarkably well. This adds this whole physical, embodied dimension to the idea of carryover. It suggests that intense trauma or strong emotions or significant events from a past life might leave not just psychological scars, but actual physical imprints that affect the developing fetus in the next life. It points towards an embodied kind of karmic continuity, almost like a wound echoing from one body to the next.
The case of Shanti Devi from India is one of the really famous ones, right? Investigated way back, even by national figures.
Yes, Shanti Devi is a classic. Born in Delhi, 1926. It's one of the most well-documented early cases investigated independently before Stevenson even got involved by a committee that included prominent Indian leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, apparently. Around age 4, she started insisting her name was actually Lugdi Bai, that she lived in a town called Mathura about 80 miles away, and that she had died about a year after giving birth to a son.
And she gave details.
Tons of details. Specifics about her life as Lugdi Bai, her husband's name, Kedarnath Job. Details about their house, her family members, the circumstances of her death during childbirth complications. The committee eventually decided to take her to Mathura to test her claims.
And what happened?
It was apparently quite dramatic. Shanti Devi, who, according to her Delhi family, had never been to Mathura before, supposedly recognized Lugdi Bai's relatives in the crowd at the train station. She navigated confidently through the unfamiliar streets directly to Lugdi Bai's former house. She correctly identified specific items inside the house that had belonged to WWII, and she even pointed out a hidden well in the courtyard that her alleged former husband, Kedarnath, confirmed only he and WWII had known about. She also apparently brought up some intimate details about their marriage that shocked him with their accuracy.
Good grief.
The fact that this independent committee, including respected figures, witnessed her doing this, recognizing people and places, knowing these specific, verifiable, sometimes private details that her current family didn't know it, added significant weight to the case, making simple explanations seem inadequate.
And the James Leninger case brings this phenomenon much closer to home for a Western audience, especially since the family was Christian and initially very skeptical.
Yes, the James Leninger case from Louisiana is incredibly compelling for many reasons. Born in 1998 into a devout Christian family. Around age 2, he started having these terrifying nightmares about being trapped in a burning plane crash. Then he began spontaneously talking during the day about flying planes being shot down and giving these incredibly specific details.
Like what?
He said his name used to be James. He flew a Corsair airplane, a specific type of WWII fighter. He said he took off from a boat called the Natoma, and that he was shot down near Iwo Jima by the Japanese.
Whoa, those are specific.
It's extremely specific. His father, Bruce Leininger, was understandably baffled and frankly disturbed. He started researching, initially just trying to understand his son's nightmares. He discovered there was a small aircraft carrier, an escort carrier, in the Pacific during WWII called the USS Natoma Bay, and it was involved in the Battle of Iwo Jima.
No way.
Yes. Digging deeper, he found squadron records listing a young pilot named James Houston Jr., who flew a Corsair fighter plane from the USS Natoma Bay and who was indeed killed in action near Iwo Jima, shot down by Japanese fire exactly as young James described. It gets even more specific. Young James also spontaneously mentioned names of other pilots from the squadron, which were verified. And later, Bruce Leininger managed to contact James Houston's elderly sister, who confirmed numerous personal details about Houston's life, that young James had mentioned details about family members, childhood toys, things that were definitely not public record. The sheer obscurity of James Houston's life, combined with the geographical distance and the family's initial skepticism, makes it exceptionally difficult to explain how young James could have acquired such precise, verifiable information through any normal means. It's a powerful challenge to conventional explanations like just cryptomnesia or childhood fantasy.
And Dr. Jim Tucker, who took over from Stevenson at the University of Virginia, he's continuing this line of research, right? Maybe focusing more on Western cases and behavioral stuff.
That's right. Dr. Tucker has diligently carried on Stevenson's legacy, maintaining those high standards of rigorous investigation. He has tended to focus more on American cases, which helps address the criticism that maybe these phenomena are just culturally specific to places where reincarnation is widely believed.
Good point.
And his work really reinforces the sheer volume and the consistency of these spontaneous childhood cases. He's particularly highlighted the significant emotional and behavioral carryovers that Stevenson also documented. Things like children exhibiting intense phobias that seem directly linked to the way the previous person died, like a phobia of water in a child who remembers drowning, or fear of loud noises in one who remembers being shot, or kids spontaneously displaying skills or knowledge they clearly haven't been taught in their current life.
Like knowing a foreign language or playing an instrument?
Sometimes, yes, or possessing detailed technical knowledge, things like that. Dr. Tucker's ongoing research at UVA is crucial because it keeps adding to this unique and, frankly, puzzling body of data. It continues to push the boundaries of what mainstream science typically studies, attempting to bring observable, empirically investigated phenomena to bear on these huge questions about consciousness, memory, and whether they might persist beyond a single lifetime.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit to another modern approach that gets talked about a lot. Regression therapy. And Dr. Brian Weiss is probably the most famous name associated with that.
Dr. Brian Weiss, yes.
Yeah.
He's an American psychiatrist and hypnotherapist whose journey into this field is interesting because he started out as a complete skeptic, very traditionally trained. He was using hypnotic regression therapy in his practice, but for the standard reasons trying to help patients access repressed childhood memories, believing that unresolved early trauma was the source of many psychological problems.
Standard psychotherapy stuff.
Exactly. But his work took a completely unexpected turn when one of his patients, during a hypnosis session aimed at finding the roots of her severe anxieties and phobias, started recounting what she described as incredibly vivid past life experiences.
And that led him to form a new hypothesis, that maybe the roots of some problems weren't in childhood, but even further back.
Precisely. As he worked with more patients who spontaneously reported similar experiences under hypnosis, Weiss developed the hypothesis that many chronic psychological issues, deep-seated phobias, recurring nightmares, persistent anxieties, panic attacks, and maybe even certain unexplained physical ailments could actually be echoes, somatic or psychological replays of traumatic events experienced in previous incarnations.
And for people who support this kind of therapy, the fact that it seems to work for some people is a big piece of evidence, right? The claimed therapeutic benefits.
That's a central argument made by proponents, yes. People like Weiss argue that the significant and sometimes remarkably rapid resolution of long-standing psychological problems or seemingly intractable phobias issues that hadn't responded to years of conventional therapy that happens after a patient recalls and processes these alleged past life memories under hypnosis. Well, it's very hard to explain if the memories were just pure fantasy or confabulation. They argued the therapeutic benefit itself, the actual healing that takes place, strongly suggests that the experienced memory, whatever its ultimate origin, has a profound psychological reality and impact for the individual. The healing points to something significant happening, even if you can't definitively prove the memory is historically accurate.
And his patient, Catherine, she was the one who really broke through his skepticism.
Yes, Catherine, a pseudonym, was the pivotal case for Weiss, the one that completely shattered his conventional scientific worldview. Under hypnosis, she not only described these vivid past life scenarios that seemed directly connected to her present-day phobias and anxieties, but what really blew his mind was when she began channeling messages. Messages from what she identified as highly evolved spirits or masters during the sessions. And these messages contain incredibly specific, verifiable information about Weiss's own deeply personal life.
His life, not hers.
His. Intimate details about his family, things Catherine couldn't possibly know, and most stunningly specific and comforting details about his deceased infant son, a tragedy he had kept very private, never shared with her or professionally.
Oh my God.
Weiss recounts that these revelations were so precise, so personal, and so impossible for Catherine to know normally, that they utterly convinced him. He concludes that Catherine, or some intelligence communicating through her, had access to knowledge far beyond normal sensory input. It convinced him that some form of consciousness or spirit survives physical death and can apparently carry memories and awareness across lifetimes. He claims he's since regressed over 4,000 patients, developing his therapeutic approach based on this conviction.
Okay, so we have spontaneous recall in kids, regression therapy, and then there's a third fascinating area you mentioned, near-death experiences, NDEs. How do they fit into this picture?
NDEs offer a really unique window because they're reported by people who are physiologically extremely close to death, maybe during cardiac arrest, deep coma, major trauma, or sometimes even under deep anesthesia.
Right.
And the experiences themselves are often described as intensely vivid, hyper-real, often perceived as feeling realer than real compared to normal waking life. Now, the classic NDE elements people talk about are things like floating out of the body, seeing a tunnel of light, meeting beings of light or deceased relatives, having a life review.
Yeah, the common stuff.
But crucially, as highlighted in your sources, some NDE accounts also include what appear to be spontaneous memories of a past lifetime.
Really? During the NDE itself?
Apparently so. In some cases, the person having the NDE reports experiencing scenes or gaining knowledge from a life that isn't their current one. Sometimes these recollections contain specific details about the deceased individual, their life, their death, which the person having the NDE might later find out are historically verifiable.
So the NDE state itself, being near death, might somehow unlock access to memories from previous lives.
That's the intriguing possibility these specific accounts raise. It suggests that being in that altered state, potentially detached from the normal functioning of the physical brain and body, might allow access to deeper layers of consciousness or memory storage that are usually completely inaccessible to us.
And the quality of NDE memories is relevant too, you said.
Yes. Research looking into the phenomenology of NDE memories is interesting here. Studies suggest that these memories are qualitatively different from memories of dreams, hallucinations, or imagined events. They tend to have a richness of detail, a strong emotional intensity, a sense of being self-experienced, and that compelling feeling of being utterly real characteristics that are actually more similar to memories of actual lived events than to fabricated ones.
And you mentioned a really interesting connection between some NDE accounts and those spontaneous childhood cases we talked about earlier.
Yes, this is particularly fascinating and potentially significant. Some of those young children who report detailed past life memories also spontaneously describe a period between their previous life and their current one. They talk about what happened after the death of the previous personality, but before they were born into their current body.
A between lives period.
Exactly. And descriptions of this between lives realm, or the experiences there, reported spontaneously by young children who also have verifiable past life memories, sometimes show really striking parallels and similarities to the descriptions of realms and experiences reported by adults during their near-death experiences.
Wow, that would be a powerful connection if it holds up. Like bridging the near-death experience in this life with the memory of transitioning between lives in the past.
Precisely. It positions NDEs as potentially offering a direct glimpse into the soul's or consciousness's journey between incarnations, a state that's otherwise almost impossible to investigate directly. If these between lives recalls, whether they come spontaneously from children or are reported during adult NDEs, are genuine reflections of an actual process.
Yeah.
They could provide critical missing pieces of the puzzle about what happens in that interval between embodiments. It would complement the research focus just on memories from the previous life itself, and it would definitely strengthen the overall argument for some kind of continuity of consciousness beyond just wishful thinking or cultural belief.
So, okay. We've traced this incredible path from the profound philosophical maps drawn by ancient traditions through their intricate ideas about the soul, karma, liberation, then shifting to these really surprising modern efforts to gather actual data on alleged past life memories, spontaneous recall, regression therapy, NDEs. Looking at the evidence, the cases, the methods, this whole vast, varied landscape clearly puts this topic right at a fascinating and sometimes pretty contentious crossroads. It naturally leads to both really deep contemplation and, understandably, some serious skepticism.
Absolutely, and you have to acknowledge that. Given the extraordinary nature of the claims we're talking about, consciousness surviving death, memories transferring between brains, things that are inherently difficult, maybe impossible to directly observe or replicate in a controlled lab setting, it's completely understandable why mainstream science, which mostly operates within a materialist framework, where consciousness is seen as purely a product of brain activity.
Right, the brain creates the mind.
Why that framework would approach these claims with significant skepticism. That's the default scientific position, really.
So what are the main alternative explanations that skeptics offer for these accounts, especially the really compelling ones? How do they explain them away?
The most common alternative explanations tend to fall into a few main categories. One big one is confabulation and fantasy. The argument here is that the vividness and detail in these accounts, especially ones recalled under hypnosis, aren't proof of historical reality. Instead, they showcase the mind's incredible ability to create elaborate narratives.
Making stuff up, basically.
Well, not necessarily deliberately lying, but individuals might unknowingly weave together bits of forgotten information they were exposed to somewhere that's called cryptomnesia.
Cryptomnesia.
Yeah.
Hidden memory.
Right. Or they might pick up on subtle suggestions, even unintentional ones, from the therapist, the interviewer, or family members. The skeptical view is simply that a really compelling, detailed story doesn't automatically equal a factual past life event. And hypnosis, especially, is known to make people highly suggestible and can unfortunately lead to the creation of convincing false memories.
And cognitive biases are seen as playing a big role, too.
Oh, definitely. Cognitive biases are considered a major factor by skeptics. Confirmation bias is huge here. People who already believe in reincarnation, or maybe who are desperately seeking answers for their current problems, might unconsciously look for and interpret information in a way that confirms what they already want to believe.
Seeing what you want to see.
Exactly. And related to that is selective reporting. Researchers or families might tend to highlight the few details that seem to match the life of a deceased person, while unconsciously downplaying or just ignoring the many details that don't match, or that are vague, or simply can't be verified. And some studies have actually shown that simply having a pre-existing belief in reincarnation is one of the strongest predictors of whether someone reports past life memories. Skeptics argue that points more towards a psychological explanation than objective recall.
What about explanations based just on the person's current life, like environment or genetics?
That's another line of argument. The idea is that behaviors, skills, knowledge, or fears that seem unlearned and are presented as proof of past life influence could potentially be explained by more conventional factors. Maybe subtle environmental influences the person was exposed to very early on and has forgotten, or perhaps genetic predispositions that manifest in complex ways we don't fully understand yet, or even just early childhood experiences that aren't consciously remembered but still leave a deep imprint on personality and behavior.
So unless you can rule all that out.
Right. The argument is that unless you can be absolutely certain there was no possible way the information or trait could have been acquired normally in this lifetime, then these conventional explanations remain more scientifically plausible, more parsimonious.
And the research methods themselves, especially Stevenson's early stuff, they've faced criticism too.
Certainly. Critics have raised legitimate methodological points, especially about the early pioneering work. Things like a perceived lack of the kind of rigorous experimental controls you'd expect in other scientific fields. The heavy reliance on anecdotal evidence, often collected years after the child first started talking, which makes it vulnerable to memory distortion and contamination from subsequent conversations, and just concerns about the sheer difficulty of ensuring accuracy and avoiding errors or omissions when conducting complex investigations across cultures, languages, or decades.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly difficult.
It is. While Stevenson's later work arguably became more rigorous in response to critiques, the inherent challenges in trying to independently verify very specific, often personal claims across time and culture remain enormous. And underlying all this is that fundamental philosophical clash. The dominant materialist scientific worldview assumes consciousness and memory are only products of brain function. If that's true, then the idea of memories or a whole personality essence somehow magically transferring between physically separate brains, often years apart, well, it just seems scientifically impossible within our current understanding of biology and physics. Those verifiable details in the best cases, while incredibly intriguing to proponents, represent such a radical challenge to the current paradigm that skeptics demand truly extraordinary airtight evidence that's arguably impossible to get in this field and would require a complete revolution in our understanding of consciousness.
Okay. But despite that very real and rigorous skepticism, you also can't just dismiss the aspects of these accounts that proponents find so incredibly compelling, the things that seem to argue against purely conventional explanations.
That's the other side of the coin, absolutely. For proponents, the sheer number of reported cases is hard to ignore. We're talking thousands documented systematically by researchers like Stevenson and Tucker, plus the thousands more claimed by therapists like Weiss working with adults. It makes it difficult to just write these off as isolated flukes or simple mistakes.
Right.
Then there's the striking consistency, often found in the details reported across many different cases by unrelated individuals, often in completely different cultures with different belief systems. That consistency seems, to proponents, like more than just random coincidence. And beyond just the factual details, there's the profound emotional depth and the specific behavioral correlates reported, especially in the children's cases. Those seemingly irrational phobias that directly link to a specific past death, or kids spontaneously showing skills or knowledge they couldn't have learned, those are powerful arguments against simple fantasy or just making things up.
And those independently verifiable details seem to be the real linchpin of the counter-argument against skepticism.
They really are. Proponents constantly emphasize that in numerous well-investigated cases, the specific, often obscure details provided by the child, or the regression subject, about the deceased person's life, their family, how they died, sometimes even intimate personal matters. These details were later independently verified. And crucially, they were details that the child or patient almost certainly could not have known through any normal channel of information. That's the core challenge thrown back at conventional explanations.
Yeah.
Proponents argue that the statistical improbability of such accurate hits happening purely by chance, especially when you factor in the really weird stuff like the physical birthmarks precisely matching fatal wounds. The odds just seem astronomical. It makes simple coincidence or deliberate fraud seem like insufficient explanations for the best cases.
And for regression therapy, those claimed therapeutic benefits are seen as evidence in their own right, you mentioned.
Yes. For proponents like Dr. Weiss, the fact that people report significant healing resolution of debilitating phobias, chronic pain, severe anxiety that resisted other treatments for years, specifically after recalling and processing these alleged past life traumas under hypnosis, that's presented as compelling evidence in itself. They ask, if these memories were just elaborate fantasies, why would engaging with them so profoundly lead to such lasting therapeutic change? It suggests the memory, regardless of its objective truth, is operating on a very deep psychological level, as if it were a real impactful trauma. Similarly, that realer-than-real quality and the richness of detail reported in NDE memories, which studies show are phenomenologically similar to actual memories, not imagined ones that adds to their compelling nature for those who have them or study them. The subjective reality for the person experiencing it is undeniable, even if we can't objectively verify the content.
It really is a frontier, isn't it? Where subjective experience, empirical investigation, and these deep philosophical frameworks all collide. Okay, stepping back from the debate about proof for a moment, what are the profound metaphysical implications if we just assume, for the sake of argument, that these accounts, or at least the core concept of rebirth, are pointing towards something genuine? What does it all mean?
Well, if we explore the implications as if rebirth is real, the consequences are vast. Firstly, it strongly suggests that karmic continuity is real, operating not just day-to-day within one life, but across multiple lifetimes. It implies that our unresolved desires, our actions, and their consequences are emotional patterns. They aren't just wiped clean at death. They continue to shape and influence the stream of consciousness of the soul as it moves forward. This provides a potentially comprehensive metaphysical framework for understanding individual differences. Why are some people born with incredible artistic genius, seemingly out of nowhere? Why do others struggle with deep, irrational fears from infancy? Why do life circumstances vary so wildly between people? From this perspective, these aren't just random genetic or environmental accidents. They are, at least partly, shaped by a very long history of cause and effect playing out over lifetimes.
So our personal identity isn't just the story of this one life, from birth to death.
Not from this viewpoint, no. Your identity becomes this much broader, cumulative tapestry, woven together across countless existences, shaped by the imprints of those samskaras again, and experiences of many, many lives. And this understanding also profoundly reframes how we might view life's challenges and suffering. Its difficulties, hardships, pain. They're no longer seen as just meaningless, arbitrary misfortunes to be resented or endured. They can be viewed, instead, as potential opportunities. Opportunities for the soul to learn crucial lessons, maybe to balance out karmic debts from the past, and to continue its long evolutionary journey toward greater wisdom and spiritual growth. The whole perspective can shift.
From victim to.
Exactly. From passively asking, why is this awful thing happening to me, to more actively engaging with it and asking, okay, what is the lesson here? What am I supposed to be learning or resolving through this experience? How can this help my evolution? It gives suffering potential meaning and purpose within a much larger cosmic context.
This is where that contemplative view you mentioned, like the one from the sage Ramana Maharshi in your sources, comes in and adds another layer of complexity, almost a paradox, right?
It truly does. Ramana Maharshi represents a very profound non-dual perspective. While he certainly acknowledged the appearance and the relative reality of things like karmic patterns, the cycle of birth and death, within the world of our everyday experience, the world governed by the ego and the mind, he strongly emphasized that from the ultimate standpoint, the standpoint of the true self, which he identified with the absolute reality, Brahman, all these concepts like past lives and karma, are ultimately irrelevant for achieving liberation.
Irrelevant? How can they be irrelevant if they're real on some level?
Because from the absolute perspective that Ramana taught, the true self, the real you, is already unborn, undying, and eternally free. It is pure, unconditioned awareness, already one with the absolute Brahman. The whole cycle of samsara, birth, death, karma, past lives, all of that is seen as a phenomena occurring within the illusion, Maya, created by the ego's mistaken identification with a temporary body and mind.
So it's like a dream the ego is having.
That's a common analogy, yes. His central teaching wasn't about investigating the dream characters or plot lines of past lives. It was about waking up from the dream altogether. His core practice was self-inquiry, constantly asking, who am I? Not to find out who was I in a past life, but to directly discover the timeless, ever-present reality that is experiencing the dream, the reality that is already beyond the entire cycle.
So from that ultimate view, birth and death are just part of the illusion of being a separate person.
Precisely. From the perspective of the absolute self, birth and death never actually happen to that. They are only experienced by the ego, the I thought, which wrongly believes itself to be the limited body-mind complex. And this creates this fascinating spiritual paradox.
It is.
While exploring past lives and understanding karma might offer really compelling insights into the mechanics of our conditioned existence, the continuity of consciousness, how patterns repeat, and that can be seen as a kind of relative truth, true within the dream. Focusing too much on them can actually be a distraction from the ultimate goal.
A distraction from waking up, from realizing that timeless self and getting off the wheel entirely.
Exactly. The ultimate spiritual purpose, from Ramana's non-dual perspective, isn't about meticulously mapping out who you were in every previous lifetime or untangling every single knot of past karma. It's about transcending the whole framework of past, present, and future lives right now by realizing the timeless, ever-present reality of the self that was never bound in the first place. Indulging too much in the fascinating stories of past identities, even if they hold some relative truth, can inadvertently reinforce the very sense of being a separate individual ego.
Which is the root of the problem.
Which is seen as the root of the illusion of being trapped in the cycle to begin with. So the focus shifts dramatically, away from accumulating knowledge about past lives and towards cultivating the deep present moment awareness, the inner stillness, the self-inquiry needed for ultimate liberation from the cycle.
Wow. That really is a profound thought to bring us towards the conclusion of this deep dive. That the spiritual purpose, maybe, of even contemplating rebirth, karma, past lives, it isn't necessarily just about satisfying our curiosity about who we were or validating some long-term identity, but potentially something much, much deeper, more transformative.
It really is. And regardless of whether you, the listener, end up accepting the literal reality of specific past life accounts as proven fact, the concept itself, as we've explored it through all these diverse sources you brought together, serves an undeniably powerful spiritual purpose for millions. It acts as this profound catalyst, a catalyst for fostering deeper compassion for yourself, recognizing your own long journey, and for others, seeing them as potentially fellow travelers on a similarly complex path.
And it fosters that heightened sense of personal responsibility you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. Tied directly back to that intricate law of karma, really engaging with the idea that every single action, every thought, every intention, no matter how small it seems, has consequences that ripple outwards, forwards through time, potentially across lifetimes, that naturally cultivates this deep sense of accountability for your choices right here, right now.
Yes, you think twice.
It does. This awareness encourages a conscious effort, a striving for goodness, for kindness, for integrity, for positive action, because you recognize you are actively weaving the fabric of your own future existence and maybe influencing the circumstances that you and others will encounter down the line.
And again, it empowers that shift in perspective when facing challenges.
Yes, absolutely. Seeing life's difficulties not just as random, unfair suffering to be endured with bitterness, but as potential opportunities. Opportunities for deep learning, for resolving old karmic patterns, for the soul's necessary growth and evolution. It really invites that proactive shift from just passively asking, why me, to actively engaging with the situation and asking, okay, what's the lesson here? How can I grow from this? How can I respond with more wisdom, more compassion, more awareness this time around?
And Ultimately, all these traditions, all these concepts, they seem to point towards an overarching goal beyond just endlessly cycling, however meaningful the lessons might be.
Liberation. That's the ultimate destination in all these frameworks, whether you call it the Hindu Moksha, the Buddhist Nirvana, or the Jain Jnana. It's about freedom. Freedom from the suffering, the ignorance, the karmic bondage that keeps us tethered to the seemingly endless cycle of rebirth. Contemplating the possibility of past lives, understanding the ongoing nature of consciousness's journey. That can be a powerful inspiration, a strong motivation to actively seek that higher spiritual realization.
How so?
It motivates people to look beyond the temporary satisfactions and material attachments, beyond the fleeting identities of this one life, and to consciously cultivate the virtues, the wisdom, the inner stillness, the transformation needed for true and lasting freedom from the whole cycle.
Which brings a profound significance right back to this present moment, doesn't it? Right.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Because it's only ever now that karma is created. It's now that purification can happen. It's now that realization can dawn. Living with this understanding of a continuous journey means recognizing the immense significance of every single moment, every choice, every thought. It's like being aware that the threads of karma and consciousness are constantly being woven right here, shaping the intricate pattern of this life and potentially many lives yet to come. So this perspective isn't really about dwelling morbidly on the past or escaping into some fantasy future. It's about inviting a conscious, responsible, and ultimately purposeful engagement with the here and now, but informed by this vast understanding that the continuous journey of consciousness is always ultimately moving towards its inherent freedom, its final self-realization, its union with whatever you conceive the ultimate reality to be.
This deep dive has really taken us on quite a ride. We navigated through those profound philosophical maps of ancient Indian traditions, unpacking their intricate ideas about the soul, or no soul, karma, liberation. Then we shifted gears completely to look at these really surprising modern investigations into spontaneous childhood memories, regression therapy, near-death experiences, looking at the data, the cases, the methods. And finally, we plunged into that fascinating ongoing dialogue between mainstream scientific skepticism, with its very valid questions, and the undeniably compelling nature of some of these accounts. We touched on the deep philosophical implications of what it all might mean, culminating in that really powerful contemplative perspective from Ramana Maharshi.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground. From the painstaking research of Stevenson and Tucker, the sheer volume of cases, those startling physical correlates, to the claimed healings in regression therapy offered by proponents like Weiss, the unique insights from NDEs, contrasting all that with the rational, conventional explanations favored by scientific skepticism, and wrestling with those fundamentally different views of the self. Is it an eternal soul, a stream of consciousness, and the different paths each tradition lays out for reaching the ultimate goal?
Which brings us right back to that really intriguing spiritual paradox we explored towards the end, the one highlighted by that Ramana Maharshi perspective from your sources. It leaves you thinking, if we accept, even hypothetically, that past lives and karmic patterns have some kind of reality, at least on a relative level, is the ultimate spiritual point of contemplating all this, about understanding and maybe accepting those past identities, those karmic traces, learning the lessons within the dream, so to speak? Is that the relative truth of our ongoing journey? Or is it, as that more absolute perspective suggests, about recognizing the timeless, unchanging self that was never actually bound, the self that's already inherently free and completely transcends the whole cycle of birth and death? And is the real spiritual work about focusing all our energy on realizing that reality right here, right now, seeing the details of past lives, however fascinating or seemingly real, as ultimately a kind of distraction from true final liberation? Which perspective resonates most with you?
It's a question that sits right at the heart of the spiritual path for many, many people. A profound question.
It certainly gives you a lot to mull over. Which perspective resonates most with you, the listener? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into what is truly an enigmatic, challenging, and profoundly human topic.